11 days after my wife's funeral, my nephew arrived at my house with his wife, 2 cars, a rented cargo trailer, and a clipboard full of notes about my rooms, my furniture, and everything they planned to change once I was gone. I was still sleeping maybe 3 hours a night. I was eating cereal for dinner and forgetting what day it was. Brett called what he was doing helping. Shelby walked through my rooms measuring doorways, frowning at my furniture, and talking about renovations as if I were already in the ground. Then they told me that at 64 I was too old to live alone. They wanted me in assisted living. They wanted the house sold. And before I had even opened all the sympathy cards stacked on the counter, Brett had already met with an estate consultant to find out how fast he could take control of everything. I almost gave in. I want to be honest about that because I think it matters. There was a night I came so close to handing it all over just to make the phone stop ringing. But my wife had left one name on a folded sticky note, and the moment I called that man, Brett's entire plan began to fall apart in his hands. Maggie and I had been married for 31 years. She taught 3rd grade at Brookfield Elementary for nearly 3 decades, and even now, years later, grown adults stop me in grocery store aisles and say, "You're Mrs. Maggie's husband, aren't you?" Some of them are nurses now. Some of them are teachers themselves. One of them is a sheriff's deputy who told me my wife was the first person who ever told him he was smart. I always answered with pride. I still do. We never had children of our own. After our second loss, we sat together on the back porch until the sun went all the way down, holding hands and not saying much, because there was nothing left to say that would not hurt more. After a while, we stopped trying to explain the pain to each other and just built a different kind of life around it. We poured everything we had into each other, into the old house we bought with far more problems than money, into Maggie's garden behind the back fence, where she grew tomatoes that never quite ripened and roses that somehow always did, and into my brother's 2 boys whenever they needed us, which for one of them turned out to be often. Maggie was quiet, but she missed nothing. She remembered who paid back borrowed money and who never mentioned it again. She remembered who looked you in the eye and who looked at the floor. She remembered who walked into our home and felt grateful, and who walked in and started doing math. My brother Dale had 2 sons, and you could not have found 2 more different men if you searched the whole state. Cole, the older one, moved out to Colorado and worked construction. He called me every single birthday without fail, and he never once asked me for $1. He never showed up at my door with a crisis dressed as a visit. Brett was the other kind. There was always a reason he needed something. Rent was late. The truck threw a rod. A business idea fell through right before it was about to pay off. He needed somebody to co-sign a loan he swore on everything he would pay back and never did. After Dale died, Brett started calling more often. At first, I thought grief had pulled us closer, and I let myself believe it because I wanted it to be true. Then he married Shelby. She smiled warmly. She spoke softly, and she studied every room in our house like she was memorizing what might one day belong to her. Maggie saw it before I did. Of course she did. Shelby never asked outright what anything was worth. She did not have to. Her eyes moved before the rest of her did. She would lift a little porcelain figurine off the mantel, turn it over to read the bottom, and set it back down very carefully, the way you handle something you have already decided is yours. She studied the framed photographs. She opened cabinets she had no reason to open. One Thanksgiving she asked, in a sweet little voice, whether the old truck out front was fully paid off. I laughed it off. Maggie did not. That evening, after Brett and Shelby had finally driven away, Maggie stood at the kitchen sink with her hands buried in the dishwater and said, without turning around, "That woman is counting our things." I told her she was imagining it. Shelby was curious, that was all, new to the family. Maggie dried her hands slowly, looked down the dark hallway toward the bedrooms, and said in a voice so quiet I almost missed it, "No, she is waiting." There was one more thing, and I only remembered it later, the way you remember a small sound that turns out to have been a warning. The Christmas before Maggie got sick, I caught Shelby standing alone in our bedroom doorway. looking at the framed photographs on Maggie's dresser. Not at the people in them, at the silver frames. She heard me on the stairs and turned with that quick, bright smile of hers and said she had only been looking for the bathroom. The bathroom was the other direction, and she had used it twice already that evening. I let it go. I told myself I was being suspicious of a guest in my own home, and that Maggie's wariness was rubbing off on me. At the time, I honestly thought my wife was being unfair to a young woman who just liked nice things. Years later, when Shelby walked back into that same house carrying a clipboard, I finally understood exactly what Maggie had seen standing in our kitchen all those years before. The spring before Maggie died, the doctor told us the cancer had already spread. Pancreatic, stage 3, sliding toward 4. He said it gently, the way good doctors learn to, but there is no gentle way to hear that the person sitting beside you, holding your hand, probably has less than a year. He gave us 8 months, we got 6. Maggie did not fall apart. That was not who she was. She made lists. She organized drawers I did not know were disorganized. She labeled folders. She spent long evenings on the phone in the back bedroom with the door pulled almost shut, and I assumed she was talking to her sister, or to the women she used to teach with. Sometimes I found a crumpled tissue tucked beside her nightstand in the morning, the only sign that she had let herself cry where I could not see. But to my face, she just kept asking whether I had eaten, whether the truck needed an oil change, whether the property taxes had been paid for the year. I thought she was trying to keep our life feeling normal for as long as she could. I did not understand, not even a little, that she was quietly preparing for the people who would come the moment our life was over. 3 days before she died, Maggie asked me to sit down beside her on the edge of the bed. Her voice was thin by then, barely above the hum of the heater, but her eyes were clear and steady, the way they always were when something mattered. She took my hand and said, "Everything is taken care of. I need you to promise me you will not let anyone rush you, or frighten you, or tell you what belongs to you." Then she gave me her last instruction. "Do not make a single decision about the house or the money for 60 days, she said. "Not one. But if anyone pressures you, or scares you, or puts a piece of paper in front of you and tells you to sign it, you go see Walter Hollis. His office is on Clement Street, above the hardware store. You go that same day." I wrote the name down on a yellow sticky note and folded it into my wallet. At the time, I figured she had set aside a little insurance money, or remembered some old account she did not want me to forget. I kissed her forehead and told her I would take care of it. She squeezed my hand once with the last real strength she had. "No," she whispered, "he will take care of it." I did not understand what she meant. But 11 days after we buried her, when Brett pulled up to my curb with that cargo trailer, my wife's final words started to make a terrible kind of sense. Maggie died on a cold Thursday morning in October, with my hand wrapped around hers and the heater ticking in the corner. The house went so quiet after that, I could hear the refrigerator from the bedroom. A week after the funeral, Brett called. He sounded gentle at first. He said he missed Aunt Maggie. He said he had been thinking about me, all alone in that big house. Then, almost like it had just occurred to him, he offered to come over and help me sort through some things. I told him I was not ready. 3 days later, he and Shelby pulled up anyway. 2 cars. A rented cargo trailer hitched behind the truck, and a stack of flattened cardboard boxes in the back seat, enough to clear out half the house in an afternoon. Shelby stepped through my front door holding a clipboard. Brett put a hand on my shoulder, gave it a squeeze, and said, "We're just here to help, Uncle Ray." But not once did either of them ask me what I needed. They did not ask how I was sleeping, or whether I had eaten, or how it felt to wake up alone for the first time in 31 years. They walked through my home talking about what should be sold, what should be thrown out, and which walls could come down. That was the moment I understood. They had not come to help me grieve. They had come prepared to remove me. Shelby drifted from room to room like the place was already hers, and I was a tenant who had overstayed. She pointed at the sectional Maggie and I bought the year we paid off the truck and said it was too old and the springs were probably gone. She stood in the doorway of Maggie's garden room and talked about tearing out the back fence to let the light in. She held both hands up in the hallway, framing the air, and told Brett they could knock through here and really open up the space. I asked them, straight out, what they thought they were doing in my house. Brett gave me a patient little smile, the kind you give a child or an old dog. "Uncle Ray," he said, "this place is just too much for one person now. You need somewhere smaller, somewhere safer. You shouldn't be climbing on a ladder cleaning gutters at your age." Then Shelby set an assisted living brochure down on my kitchen table, right next to the cold coffee I had forgotten about, and slid it toward me with 2 fingers. I was 64. I still split my own firewood. I still drove 4 hours to the lake without thinking twice. I handled every bill, every tax payment, every repair in that house, the way I had for 3 decades. But they spoke to me like I was confused, like I needed managing. They were not offering me help. They were trying to convince me, gently and steadily, that I had lost the right to decide where I would live and die. I told them to load their empty boxes back into that trailer and get out of my house. But Brett did not stop. That was just the first move. He called every single day after that. Sometimes Shelby called instead in that soft, patient voice to talk about property taxes and roof repairs and the lovely senior communities she had toured nearby, just so I would have the information when I was ready. Then the relatives started. People I had not heard from in years began calling with the exact same message, almost word for word. Maybe the house really was too much for me now. Maybe Brett was only looking out for me. Maybe it would not hurt to at least tour one of those places. That was when I understood what I was actually up against. This was not concern. It was a campaign, and it was coordinated. Brett had already gone around the family and told everyone I was confused, overwhelmed, leaving the stove on, missing bills. He was building a story about me before I even knew I was supposed to be defending myself. He was laying the groundwork to have me declared a man who could no longer manage his own affairs. My cousin Brenda called and asked very kindly whether I had been remembering to pay my electric bill. I had, every month on time, the way I always did. But Brett had told her I was behind on it and leaving the burner lit overnight. Neither thing was true. But here is what I learned the hard way. Once a rumor like that gets loose in a family, people start watching you, waiting to catch the smallest slip that proves the story right. For 2 solid weeks, every phone call made the walls of my own house feel like they were inching closer. And one exhausted Thursday night, I came within a single phone call of giving the whole thing away. That night, the television flickered across the living room, but I could not have told you the score. My coffee had gone cold again. The assisted living brochure was still sitting on the table where Shelby left it, and I had not had the strength to throw it out. After 2 weeks of calls and warnings and relatives telling me Brett only wanted what was best, I was just tired, bone tired, the kind of tired where surrender starts to look like rest. I picked up the phone. I was going to call Brett and tell him to come back, that we could talk about the house, that I would look at the brochure. My thumb was already moving toward his name in the contacts. I remember thinking, with a kind of dull relief, that at least the calls would stop. At least the relatives would stop watching me like I was a man about to fall down the stairs. I had spent my whole life being the one who fixed things, who handled things, and for the first time I just wanted somebody else to take the weight, even if the somebody was the one person who should never have had it. Then my wallet slid off the arm of the chair and hit the floor. A folded yellow note slipped out and landed face up on the carpet. Walter Hollis, Clement Street. Maggie's last instruction. I sat there and stared at her handwriting until the fog in my head started to lift. She had told me, 3 days before she died, not to let anyone rush me or frighten me. And Brett had done both. He had done both on purpose. So I did not call him. The next morning, I got in the truck and drove to Clement Street. And what was waiting for me inside that little office above the hardware store proved that my wife had been preparing for this exact betrayal for 12 years. Before I tell you what was inside that folder, do me a favor. If you have ever watched someone underestimate a quiet person and live to regret it, Hit subscribe, because this next part is the reason she told me to keep that note. Walter Hollis's office sat above an old hardware store, up a narrow staircase that smelled like sawdust and floor wax. The receptionist looked up the moment I walked in before I said a single word and said, "You must be Maggie's husband." That stopped me cold in the doorway. My wife had been dead for less than 3 weeks, and a stranger in an office I had never set foot in knew my face. Hollis turned out to be a thin man in his late 60s, with reading glasses hanging from a little chain around his neck. He shook my hand, told me he was sorry for my loss, and meant it. Then he sat me down across from his desk, pulled a thick folder from a locked drawer, and laid it on the wood between us. "Your wife first came to see me 12 years ago," he said. "And she came back, like clockwork, every year or two after that. The last time was this past spring." He looked at me over the glasses. She knew exactly what she wanted every single time. He opened the folder. Inside were copies of the deed to my house, bank statements, account forms, and pages covered in Maggie's small, neat handwriting. In the margins, she had written dates, questions, little reminders to herself. I recognized that lettering. It was the same hand that wrote our grocery lists and signed every birthday card I ever got from her. Then Hollis told me the truth. 12 years ago, Maggie had created a living trust, and she had quietly kept it up to date ever since. The house, our savings, a private investment account I did not even know we had, that she had been feeding a little at a time for years. All of it had been moved into that trust while she was still alive. And I was the only person on earth with the authority to control any of it. I had to ask him to slow down and explain it again, because none of it fit the shape of the woman I thought I knew, even though it fit her perfectly. Hollis was patient. He told me that a will and a trust are not the same thing, and that the difference was the whole point of what Maggie had done. "A will has to go through probate," he said. "Probate is public, it is slow, and it can be challenged. If your wife had only left a will, your nephew could have hired a lawyer, tied the house up in court for a year, questioned every page, and pressured you into settling just to make it stop." He tapped the folder. "Your wife did not want to leave you in a fist fight, so she made sure there would be no fight at all. By moving the house and the accounts into the trust," he explained, "none of it had to pass through probate when she died. There was no public estate for Brett to attack. The house was not sitting out in the open, waiting to be claimed. It was already held inside the trust with one person named to control it. That person was me. Sole trustee, primary beneficiary, only signature that mattered." I asked him why she never told me. 12 years, and she never said one word. Hollis leaned back in his chair and was quiet for a moment. "She told me you were a proud man," he said. "She said you would have felt managed, handled. She did not want you to spend your good years feeling like she did not trust you to take care of things." He paused. "She wanted you protected. She just did not want you to feel small while she did it." That answer cracked something open in my chest, right there in that little office, and I had to look out the window for a minute before I could speak again. For 12 years, while Brett was borrowing money and Shelby was turning over our figurines, my wife had been quietly building a wall of paper around our whole life. Deeds, signatures, account titles, beneficiary forms. Brick by brick, year after year, without ever once making me feel like she was doing it. And Brett had shown up with a trailer, never knowing there was nothing inside that house he could ever take. I asked Hollis, the one question Brett was counting on me never thinking to ask. "Can they fight it?" Hollis closed the folder and folded his hands on top of it. "They can try," he said. "There are 2 ways they could come at you, and your wife shut down both of them. The first is the estate itself, and like I told you, there is nothing meaningful in probate for them to contest. The trust is airtight. I drafted it. I have watched her update it for over a decade, and I will testify to her intentions and her clear mind every step of the way." He took off his glasses. "The second way," he went on, "is the one your nephew has actually been working on. He has been telling people you cannot manage your own affairs. He is trying to build a case that you are not competent, so a court might appoint someone, probably him, to control everything for you." He looked at me steadily. But you walked up those stairs on your own. You drive, you pay your bills, you manage this conversation better than half the men your age. The moment a judge meets you, that story falls apart, and the trust names a successor I chose with your wife, not a court appointee. So even that road leads nowhere. He shook his head slowly. It will cost them real money to try, and they will lose. I sat with that for a long moment. The house belonged to the trust. I controlled the trust. I was plainly, obviously capable of running my own life, which meant every phone call, every planted rumor, every assisted living brochure, and every empty box in that cargo trailer had been built on top of a lie they had told themselves. They thought grief had made me defenseless. They never once stopped to consider that my quiet wife had seen them coming years before I had. By the time Brett ever picked up the phone to start his little campaign, my wife had already beaten him. I drove home that afternoon with the window cracked, even though the November air was sharp enough to sting. For the first time, all of it made sense. The phone calls behind the half-closed bedroom door, the labeled folders, the appointments she never explained, the way she watched Shelby handle our things, and the way she went quiet every time Brett asked me for money just one more time. She had seen the danger long before I had the first idea it was coming. But Maggie did not argue. She did not accuse anyone. She never warned Brett or Shelby off, never gave them a reason to move faster or cover their tracks. She did something far smarter than any of that. She built the protection into paper and let it sit there, silent, waiting, for 12 years, while Brett borrowed and Shelby counted. My wife was quietly making certain that neither of them would ever lay a finger on what the two of us had built together. She never needed them to know. That was the whole genius of it. They thought they were arriving early, before anyone could stop them. They never understood that the only person who could have stopped them had already done it, years before they ever backed that trailer up to my curb. That evening, I called Brett. I let him say his whole piece first. The property taxes, the roof, the housing market, the brochure he had mailed me, the one I should really take a look at. I let him run all the way to the end of it. Then I said, "You met with an estate consultant." The line went silent. I told him I had seen the rented trailer with my own 2 eyes. I named the relatives he had been calling, and I repeated, word for word, the story he had been spreading about me, that I was confused, that I was leaving the stove lit, that I could not be trusted to run my own life anymore. I could hear him scrambling for a new angle. Before he found one, I said, "Maggie put everything into a trust 12 years ago. The house, the savings, all of it. There is no estate for you to get your hands on, Brett. There never was." Another long silence. For the first time since the funeral, my nephew had absolutely nothing ready to say. Finally, he found his footing, and what he reached for told me everything. "So you're really going to let money come between family," he said. I tightened my grip on the phone. "You came to my house 11 days after I buried my wife," I said. "You brought a cargo trailer, a clipboard, and a plan to move me out before my head was even clear enough to fight back." He tried to cut in. I kept going. "You told the whole family I was losing my mind. You hired a man to help you take my estate before Maggie had been gone a month. You stood in my living room and talked about my house like I was already dead." His voice went hard. "We were only trying to help you." "No," I said. "You were trying to make a profit off the worst week of my life." Then I told him plainly, the house was mine, the accounts were protected, and he was never to contact me about my property again. I hung up before he could come up with one more excuse. For the first time since Maggie died, my home felt like it belonged to me again. A week later, Shelby sent a long, careful message. "They had only ever wanted what was best for me," she wrote, "and she hoped we could move past this whole misunderstanding as a family." I did not answer it. Then Cole called from Colorado. Brett had gotten to him first, of course. He had told Cole that I was grieving, irrational, refusing all help, possibly not well in the head. So I sat down and told Cole everything. The trailer, the clipboard, the brochure on my kitchen table. The relatives Brett had called to poison the well. The estate consultant he had hired before his aunt's flowers had even wilted. When I finished, the line was quiet for a long time. Then Cole said, "Uncle Ray, I'm so sorry. I had no idea. I swear to you, I had no idea." He believed me, and I will tell you why. The details were too ugly and too specific to be the inventions of a confused old man. A confused man does not remember the exact words of a rumor. A confused man does not know what an estate consultant is. Since that day, Cole has called me every week. Just to talk, just to check in. We have grown closer in the last few months than we did in the 20 years before. And the rest of the family slowly stopped defending Brett. A few of them called to apologize once they heard the whole story. Others just went quiet and drifted off, embarrassed by what they had so easily believed. Brenda, the cousin who had asked about my electric bill, sent me a card with a handwritten note inside that said only, "I should have asked you first. I am sorry." Brett and Shelby never did challenge the trust. They could not afford to. Cole told me later that the two of them had already burned through nearly $4,000 on consultations, document reviews, and legal opinions. All of it spent hunting for a crack in an estate that had no cracks in it. That money was simply gone. The trailer went back to the rental, lot empty, and the whole family now understood exactly why those two had shown up at my door so fast after the funeral. Nobody had to confront them publicly. The consequences were quieter than that, and somehow worse. The invitations stopped. Phone calls went unanswered. Relatives who had repeated Brett's story to my face now crossed the room to avoid him at the next family gathering. Even Shelby's polished little speech about helping a poor elderly widower stopped landing, because everyone had finally seen the trailer for what it was. They had expected to drive away with a house, a load of furniture, and control of my savings. Instead, they drove away with $4,000 gone, an empty trailer, and the lost respect of the entire family they had tried to use. I did not have to destroy their reputation. They packed it up and hauled it off in that trailer themselves. I still live in the house Maggie and I bought together more than 30 years ago. The roof has been replaced twice. The floorboards still creak in the same spot near the kitchen. Her garden behind the fence is more overgrown now, because I never learned to coax things out of the ground the way she could. But the roses still come back every year, stubborn as she was, whether I tend them right or not. Every morning I carry my coffee out back and sit on the old bench we found at a yard sale for next to nothing, the summer we got married. The house does not feel like something Brett almost took anymore. It feels like proof of what Maggie protected. Because she saved more than property and money. She saved the life we built. She saved the memory in every room. She saved my right to grieve my own wife without being shoved out the door while I was still numb. Brett looked at this place and saw a house. Maggie looked at it and saw our whole life, and because of her, I am still sitting inside it. The yellow sticky note is still in my wallet. Walter Hollis, Clement Street. The folds are worn soft and the ink has faded, but I cannot bring myself to throw it away. It was the last instruction my wife ever gave me, and it saved more than a house. It saved my dignity. Brett and Shelby were so sure that grief had made me weak. What they never understood is that for 12 years, my wife had been quietly turning love into preparation. She did not need revenge. She did not raise her voice once. She only needed the truth, written down and protected on paper, waiting for the day it would be needed. I used to believe that strength meant confronting people before they could hurt you, standing up loud and fast. Maggie taught me something different, and she taught it to me from beyond the grave. Sometimes the strongest thing a person can do is see the danger clearly, prepare for it carefully, and let the truth speak for itself when the moment finally arrives. So if you are grieving, and someone shows up too fast, smiling too much, talking about what is best for you, I need you to do one thing. Slow down. Do not sign anything because someone sounds confident. Do not surrender control just because 3 relatives keep repeating the same advice in the same words. Ask questions. Keep copies, and go find a lawyer who works for you and nobody else. You are always allowed to say, "I need more time." The right people in your life will respect that. The wrong ones will show you exactly who they are by how hard they push back. Brett came from my house because he believed grief had left the door standing wide open. Maggie had locked that door 12 years before he ever turned the handle. And that, I think, is the truest thing I learned through all of it. Sometimes justice is not revenge at all. Sometimes it is simply the moment you discover that the person who loved you most had already made sure that greed would walk away with empty hands. Love did not stop protecting me when she died. It just kept working quietly, the way she always did, long after she was gone. If this story stayed with you, tell me in the comments. Would you have confronted them the moment they walked in with that trailer? Or would you have stayed silent until you had the truth on paper, the way Maggie did? And if you believe that quiet people are often the strongest ones in the room, subscribe for more emotional stories about betrayal, patience, and the kind of justice that finally brings peace.